If I asked you to go out right now and run a 6-hour marathon, how many of you would do it? Okay, we have a few crazy people in the crowd, but most of you probably wouldn't. This is exactly what happens in our classrooms every time we ask students to be active and participate. Because in the mind of a 12-year-old, a full day of school is like running a 6-hour marathon. So if we want students to be actively engaged, instead of telling them to go run the marathon, we need to try and nudge them to run 10 more feet. So this man is Richard Thaler. He's been in the news recently. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in economics this month for a theory he calls nudging. Thaler says that nudging is not a requirement and never results in a penalty. Instead, he says nudging is simply learning how people think so that we can make it easier for them to make certain decisions. A perfect example of this theory can be found in the men's bathrooms at an airport in Amsterdam. Sanitation staff at this airport were running into a bit of a problem, specifically with spillage around men's urinals. This caused cleaning costs to rise dramatically over the course of a year. So the sanitation staff thought, and they came up with a brilliant idea. They decided to etch a small black fly into the bottom corner of every urinal. The results were dramatic. This immediately improved men's aim, and cleaning bills dropped dramatically over the course of a year. This is a nudge. So, if we can apply this theory to schools in Ukraine, then we can improve teachers' aim and as a result, increase student achievement. I've had the opportunity to practice this theory in Ukraine while teaching here over the past 2 years. And I've developed a very simple formula that we can use as teachers. Basically, it focuses on 2 pieces. First, we need students to buy in to our tasks. And once we have them there, we need to keep them there. We need to keep them interested. In order to do these 2 things, we need to first offer students a reward. For me, my rewards are always involving food, because students love to eat and they're always hungry. It's very easy. Second, we need to consistently reinforce student participation in whatever we're asking them to participate in. So very simply, every time students participate, we need to follow that up with something like verbal praise. For example, good job or молодец. And finally, we need to energize students throughout this process. At this step, teachers really need to take a step back, and we need to rely on our student leaders who are already in the classroom to motivate their students and keep them engaged throughout the process. Now, as I said, I've had the opportunity to use this theory in the classroom. What I've noticed, though, in Ukrainian education is that more often than not, the approach is more of a Soviet shove than a gentle nudge. I think teachers have a natural tendency, not just in Ukraine, but everywhere, to be very strict with their students. But this only results in one thing. It pushes students farther away. If we want to engage students, we need to try and nudge them instead of shove them. So, over the course of a year, just this past month, I changed my thinking about how I would get students to participate. I decided that instead of forcing students to practice English, I would invite them themselves to decide when and how they would do it. I was walking into class each day, and the night before, I would give an assignment or ask them to study for a quiz the following day. And I would walk in, I would see my students, and I would notice they either didn't do the assignment or they didn't study for the test, and many of them failed. I would walk out of those classes thinking, why are my students so lazy, and why do they refuse to practice at home? Again, though, I had to change my thinking. And so I developed this little board that you can see on the projector. The task was simple. Without any introduction to my students, I posted this bulletin board in the hallway. The task was that each day I would post a verb to the board, and I would ask students to write sentences using the verb that was posted. They would then have to submit their sentences to their assigned class folder. The teams were split up by classes. And as Ukrainian teachers, we know that a class is like a small family. Students take a lot of pride in their class. This was going to be the crux of my student motivation. The competition would last for 5 days. And at the end of those 5 days, the winning team would receive a pizza party. So, day one rolled around. I became a little discouraged at the end of day one because, as you can see from the graph, there wasn't a lot of participation. Most classes had written 10 to 20 sentences. That's an average of half or one sentence per student. I walked home that day thinking, okay, this nudge isn't working. I'm going to have to try something else. But I persisted and I went on to day two. When I tallied up the results at the end of day two, I was shockingly happy and pleasantly surprised. And as you can see in day two, student participation rose dramatically. Most classes had submitted 50 sentences in a single day, and one class had even exceeded 200. By day three, students were swarming the board, trying to see the results of their classes. At this point, many classes had exceeded 200, some had exceeded 300, except for one class. And you can see it. 7A had only submitted a mere 35 sentences. This was my senior class. And they simply said, Mr. Gable, we're not interested. This isn't important to us. We don't care. So I thought to myself, how can they be motivated with this nudge without me directly telling them that they had to write sentences? Well, I didn't have to do anything. Later that day, I arrived in 7A, and I suddenly became surrounded by students. They told me that a friendly bet had been placed between 6A and 7A. 6A was leading the school, having written the most sentences, and they were very confident that they were going to win. This pure motivation is what drove 7A, and they came up to me and said, Mr. Gable, we need to beat 6A. How many sentences do we need to write in order to win? I said, look, you're very far behind. You probably need to write at least 1,000 sentences in a single night in order to beat 6A. And I was thinking that this was going to make them quit, but instead, they immediately started cutting up new slips of paper, and they started writing frantically. They had less than 24 hours to make more than 1,000 sentences. Well, I walked home that evening thinking it will be impossible for 7A to write these sentences. But when I arrived to school the next morning, I was pleasantly surprised with a trash bag filled to the brim with their sentences. This trash bag has more than 1,000 sentences. Actually, specifically, it has 1,200 sentences written by 22 students. You do the math, because I'm not a math teacher. So I looked at these sentences, and my first thought was, now I have to count these. So the results of the competition were delayed, because I spent the next few nights hand counting each of these sentences to make sure that they weren't writing the same sentence over and over, and they didn't. They wrote all original sentences 1,200 times. So the day finally came when I would announce the results of the competition. I called 6A and 7A into the main hallway. They gathered a large group of roughly 40 students, and they waited eagerly to hear who would win. And 6A had written 800 sentences in a single night, while 7A had written 1,200 sentences. But remember, this was a 5-day competition. So 6A had 1,300 sentences, while 7A had 1,235. 6A was cheering, they were excited, they were giving each other high fives, they knew that they were the winners. 7A walked out of the hall feeling quite disappointed and sad. Although I felt bad for 7A, I also felt really happy that they had discovered meaning in practicing English without me telling them that they had to. They had come up with this motivation purely from a simple nudge in the school hallway. Over the course of 5 days, students from 9 classes wrote over 5,000 sentences. The excitement that week from students, needless to say, was addictive and palpable. I was nudged to go to school early every morning to post the new verb and count the sentences. My students were nudged to practice English outside the classroom in their free time willingly. I think as teachers, the more time we spend on the other side of the desk, the easier it becomes for us to forget what students feel and think about the tasks we ask them to do. Students aren't necessarily lazy as much as they are overwhelmed by boredom. So in the future, when we design tasks that require student participation, we need to remember to etch a fly into every one. It'll improve our aim and their success. We are teachers. We can do this. Thank you.